Welcome back to Unforeseen Fates. Today, we begin with a case that feels almost unreal, a workplace grudge that escalated into something chillingly deliberate. It's the story of a man who took his grievances, turned them into violence, and then confessed, not to the police, but in an email to Human Resources. The victim was Jeffrey Jeff Muller, 44 years old, a forklift operator at the Lowe store on Viewmont Drive in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Jeff wasn't just an employee clocking in and out. He was a father of 3 young daughters, a man known for his booming laugh, his kindness, and his dedication to family. Friends say he had recently found his faith again and was planning to be baptized alongside his daughters on Father's Day. For him, work was simply a way to provide stability, to keep his family safe and cared for. On the night of June 14th, 2025, Jeff was on his usual shift, maneuvering pallets with his forklift. It should have been routine. But his co-worker, Christopher Wisniewski, 36, had been carrying anger for months. Investigators later revealed that he claimed Jeff had harassed him and that his complaints had gone unanswered. Instead of leaving his job or finding another way to resolve the tension, Wisniewski bought a gun, practiced with it in his backyard, and walked into Lowe's that night with a plan. At around 12:30 a.m., the plan unfolded. Wisniewski pulled out a Springfield 9mm handgun and shot Jeff at close range. First a bullet to the chest, then more to the head and back. Surveillance footage showed the killer standing over Jeff, firing multiple times as Jeff lay on the ground, still alive, still pleading. Co-workers fled in terror, dialing 911. Jeff was rushed to the hospital, but the wounds were too severe. He did not survive. And then came the detail that makes this case unforgettable. After the murder, Wisniewski didn't run. He calmly sent an email to Lowe's Human Resources Department, confessing to the killing and saying it could have been avoided if someone had listened. He also called 911 and told dispatchers directly, "I was the person that did it." Police arrested him at the scene. In later interviews, Wisniewski admitted that he had planned the murder, framing it as his response to being pushed too far. Prosecutors, however, saw only a calculated, deliberate act. He was charged with first and third-degree murder and ordered held without bail. For Jeff's family, the loss was indescribable. His sister spoke out publicly, saying that Lowe's ignored warning signs and failed to protect him. She accused the company of overlooking red flags that might have prevented the tragedy. At vigils, friends and loved ones described Jeff as the center of his family's world, a man who wanted nothing more than to raise his daughters with love and stability. The community rallied, raising money to support his children. But for those who knew Jeff, no amount of support could ease the pain of losing a father whose life was stolen in such a violent and deliberate way. This case leaves haunting questions behind. Could the murder have been prevented if HR had acted sooner? Was this truly about harassment, or was it a man searching for an excuse after deciding to kill? And perhaps the hardest truth of all, if one worker's anger could erupt into this level of violence, how many other workplace conflicts might be silently simmering, waiting to explode? Jeff Muller's murder was chilling, not just for its violence, but for its cold premeditation. A co-worker who had been simmering with resentment not only pulled the trigger, but calmly confessed to HR as if this was a problem he believed the company had created. That single act made the world question whether workplace complaints can ever be ignored. But as shocking as that was, the violence at Lowe's was only the beginning. Because just a month later in Michigan, a routine workplace disagreement between a manager and her employee escalated into one of the most brutal stabbings ever witnessed in a fast food restaurant. On the morning of July 10th, 2025, a normal day at the McDonald's on 9 Mile Road in Eastpointe, Michigan, turned into horror. This was a place of routine. Customers grabbing breakfast before work, employees rushing to fill orders, and managers trying to keep things running smoothly. For Jennifer Jama Harris, this restaurant wasn't just a job, it was her second home. Jennifer was 39 years old, a single mother of 6 children, and a 15-year veteran of that McDonald's location. People who worked with her called her tough but fair, a woman who knew how to run a fast food restaurant with precision and pride. For her family, she was the backbone, working long hours to ensure her children never went without. She was more than a manager. She was a mother trying to hold everything together. That morning, a dispute broke out between Jennifer and one of her employees, 26-year-old Afeni Badu Muhammad. Details suggest it was about work performance, the kind of disagreement that happens in workplaces every day. Jennifer sent Muhammad home early from her shift, a decision that should have ended things, but instead it became the spark for an unthinkable act of violence. Not long after leaving, Muhammad returned. She came back through the employee entrance, masked and carrying a knife more than 3 inches long. The setting was small, crowded, the drive-through area where staff moved quickly to keep orders flowing. There, Muhammad confronted Jennifer and launched a frenzied attack. Witnesses say she stabbed her manager again and again, possibly up to 15 times. The violence was overwhelming. Coworkers froze in shock, some too stunned to react, others running for safety. Customers in the drive-through line had a front-row view of the nightmare unfolding inside. In that moment of terror, one customer, legally armed, made a choice that likely saved others. He fired a warning shot through the window, startling Muhammad. When she fled the building, the customer chased her down and, in a dramatic foot pursuit, managed to corner her and hold her at gunpoint until police arrived. The customer's quick thinking ended the assault, but by then, Jennifer had suffered too many wounds. She was rushed to the hospital. Despite frantic efforts by doctors, Jennifer Harris was pronounced dead. In an instant, 6 children were left without their mother. The grief that followed was crushing. At a vigil, hundreds gathered as balloons rose into the sky in Jennifer's honor. Her daughter, Antonia, spoke through tears. "It hurts so bad that my mama is not here. She died trying to take care of us." Those words echoed the very essence of Jennifer's life. Everything she did was for her children. The community rallied to help, creating the Jennifer Harris Legacy Fund to provide for her children. But alongside the grief came anger. How could this have happened? And why had the signs not been seen sooner? Because this wasn't Afeni Muhammad's first brush with violence. In January 2022, she had been arrested in Virginia for stabbing her boyfriend during a domestic dispute. She pleaded guilty to felony wounding. Shockingly, she received no prison time, only a suspended sentence and probation under conditions that included counseling. That earlier attack was a clear red flag, and yet, 3 years later, she was back in a position of conflict, this time with deadly results. On July 11th, 2025, Muhammad stood before a judge. She was charged with first-degree premeditated murder, carrying a dangerous weapon with unlawful intent, and as a habitual offender. Bond was set at an extraordinary $25 million. The conditions, had she been able to post bail, included GPS monitoring, daily check-ins, drug testing, and an order to avoid Jennifer's family and the McDonald's. For Jennifer's family, none of that brings her back. Her 6 children must now navigate life without the woman who fought so hard for them. And for the rest of us, this case lingers as more than just a tragic story. It is a cautionary tale. It forces us to ask, how many violent offenders slip through the cracks, avoiding prison time, only to reappear in stories like this? Could this tragedy have been prevented if her past had been taken more seriously? Jennifer Harris's life ended in a place where she gave so much of herself, and her story stands as a haunting reminder that even ordinary disagreements in the workplace can turn into something unthinkable when the wrong person decides violence is the answer. The murder of Jennifer Harris left her 6 children without their mother, and it showed us how fragile the line is between authority and rebellion in the workplace. An employee disciplined at work chose to come back with a knife, and in seconds, a mother's life was stolen. It was deeply personal, intimate, and devastating, but the next case adds a new layer, because when violence struck at a Wegmans warehouse in New York, it didn't end with the shooting. The killer fled across state lines, triggering a multi-state manhunt that turned a workplace crime into a national pursuit. On Saturday, July 26th, 2025, the Wegmans distribution center in Gates, New York, was busy with the kind of steady rhythm you'd expect from one of the largest food chains in the state. Forklifts beeped in reverse, boxes moved along conveyors, and workers hustled in the late afternoon heat. For many employees, it was just another day. Clock in, put in the hours, go home. For 25-year-old Jameer Ridley Smith, it should have been no different. But that day ended in bloodshed, grief, and a desperate chase across state lines. Jameer was young, full of life, and well-liked by those around him. Friends and family would later describe him as hardworking and ambitious, someone who carried himself with quiet determination. At 25, he was still at the beginning of his adult journey, shaping a future with possibilities that now will never be realized. At around 4:15 p.m., everything changed. Gunshots suddenly rang out inside the distribution center. Panic erupted. Workers screamed, ducked, and sprinted for cover. Some scrambled out through side doors, while others crouched behind stacks of goods, trying to understand what was happening. When the shooting stopped, Jameer lay on the ground with multiple gunshot wounds. Despite frantic attempts to save him, he was pronounced dead on the scene. The very place where he came to earn a living had become the site of his death. The alleged shooter was identified as 32-year-old Kishan Green, a fellow employee. What drove Green to pull the trigger remains unclear even now. Police have not released a motive, and speculation swirls about whether this was a sudden outburst or the culmination of a simmering conflict. What is clear is that Green didn't stay to face the consequences. Immediately after the shooting, he fled the scene. The manhunt that followed turned this tragedy into a story of interstate pursuit. Law enforcement tracked Green down to Knoxville, Tennessee, more than 700 miles from the warehouse. He was arrested the very next day by U.S. Marshals, who found him carrying a loaded 9mm handgun. The fact that he made it out of the state so quickly raises even more questions. Was this something he had planned, or was it simply the frantic escape of a man who knew his life had just changed forever? Green was extradited back to New York to face justice. In Monroe County Court, he was charged with second-degree murder. At his first appearance, he entered a not guilty plea. The courtroom was heavy with tension as he stood before the judge, silent and expressionless, while the family of Jameer watched on. The judge ordered him held without bail, with the next hearing scheduled for October. But while the courts prepare their case, Jameer's family prepares for life without him. In the days following his death, loved ones gathered for a vigil outside the warehouse. Balloons floated into the evening sky, candles flickered, and his name was spoken over and over again in grief and remembrance. A young man's life, full of promise, had been taken so suddenly that even weeks later, family and friends struggled to believe it was real. The pain was made worse by the lack of answers. Unlike some cases where motives are clear, jealousy, rage, revenge, here the why remains a mystery. His family is left with the unbearable burden of not only losing him, but never fully understanding why he was killed. This case isn't just about one act of violence, it's about the ripple effect. Coworkers who witnessed the attack will carry those images forever. Families of both the victim and the suspect are left devastated on opposite sides of a senseless tragedy. And the wider community is left to wonder how a workplace, supposed to be a place of security and routine, can transform in seconds into a crime scene. For Jameer Ridley Smith, there is no second chance. His life ended before it could truly unfold. And for us, his story stands as a chilling reminder of how fragile life is and how workplace violence can strike without warning, leaving only questions, grief, and the search for justice. The murder of Jameer Ridley Smith left his family in mourning and his killer on the run. Caught in Tennessee, hundreds of miles away, the fugitive Coworkers capture reminded us that violence has a way of crossing borders, its impact stretching far beyond where it begins. But in Brooklyn, the next case would show us something equally terrifying, because this time the killer wasn't a current employee. He was someone from the past, a man who had left the job, but whose anger lingered like an ember, waiting for the moment to ignite again inside an IHOP restaurant. On Friday night, September 5th, 2025, the IHOP on Flatlands Avenue in East New York, Brooklyn, was preparing to close. The late-night customers had finished their meals, families were heading out into the humid September air, and inside, the final cleaning began. For Hector Reinoso-Perez, a 67-year-old employee, it was another routine night. He had been sweeping and mopping floors, making sure the restaurant was spotless before the morning crew arrived. Hector was well known to his coworkers as dependable and kind-hearted. At his age, he could have slowed down, but he chose to keep working, to stay active, and to provide for his family. His granddaughter, Daniela, later said that he never wanted problems with anyone, that he was a loving man whose presence held the family together. This was supposed to be just another night of honest work for him, but at around 11:40 p.m., everything changed. Wilbur Salazar Rios, a 44-year-old former employee, walked back into the IHOP. Rios no longer worked there, but he carried with him anger and resentment. Witnesses say he confronted Hector inside the restaurant and followed him into the restroom. In that small, confined space, he pulled out a knife and stabbed Hector in the torso. The attack was sudden, brutal, and personal. Another employee, a 41-year-old coworker, heard the struggle and rushed in to try to stop it. He was cut in the hand during the attempt, but his intervention may have saved others from being hurt. By then, though, Hector had collapsed from his wounds. The restaurant descended into chaos. Customers who were still lingering screamed and ran for the exits. Staff scrambled to call 911. The restroom, a place meant for brief privacy, had become a crime scene soaked in fear and violence. Police arrived quickly and arrested Rios at the scene. He was charged with murder, assault, and criminal possession of a weapon. In court, he claimed Hector had pushed him earlier that evening, and he tried to deny responsibility by saying he didn't know where the knife came from, but prosecutors described his actions as cold and intentional. The judge ordered him held without bail. Hector was rushed to Brookdale University Hospital, but doctors couldn't save him. His death was declared shortly after arrival. News of his killing spread quickly across Brooklyn, and what shocked people most was not just the violence itself, but where it happened. In a family restaurant during closing time, carried out by someone who used to be part of the same team. For Hector's family, the loss was devastating. His granddaughter Daniela described how her entire family had been torn apart, saying, "My cousin hasn't eaten for days. Now that he's gone, it just feels like something is missing." To them, Hector wasn't just a worker. He was a father, a grandfather, and a steady, gentle presence in their lives. The murder also raised disturbing questions. Rios had left IHOP, yet his anger lingered long enough to pull him back through those doors, with lethal intent. It forced people to confront a terrifying thought. What if workplace conflicts don't end when someone quits or is let go? What if grudges continue to smolder, only to erupt later in violence? Hector's story is tragic, not just because of how he died, but because of who he was. A man who lived simply, worked honestly, and loved deeply. His life ended in the place where he labored, at the hands of someone who should have been part of his past. Now, for his family and coworkers, that restaurant will forever be haunted by the memory of what happened that night. The stabbing of Hector Reinoso-Perez inside a Brooklyn IHOP restroom revealed something haunting. That workplace conflict doesn't always disappear when someone walks away. Old grudges can fester, and sometimes they return with knives in hand. But not all workplace killings are fueled by grudges. Some are senseless, leaving families without answers. And in Georgia, that's exactly what happened when a 21-year-old father, working to support his child, was gunned down in the parking lot of an Amazon warehouse. His family was left asking not only how, but why. On January 13th, 2025, the sprawling Amazon fulfillment center in Pooler, Georgia, was alive with its usual relentless energy. Hundreds of workers were moving packages, forklifts hummed, and the warehouse echoed with the sound of efficiency. For most employees, the night was just another shift. For 21-year-old Keontae Grider, it was a step toward building the life he dreamed of for his young child. But in a matter of minutes, that dream was violently stolen. Keontae had clocked in, like always, working hard under the bright lights and long hours. When he stepped outside into the cool night air to take a short break, he couldn't have known it would be his last. In the parking lot, where workers usually exchanged laughs or quick phone calls, the sound of gunfire ripped through the stillness. Panic erupted. Some employees dropped to the ground. Others sprinted toward the doors, shouting for help. A few froze, shocked at the sudden violence invading such a familiar space. By the time police arrived, Keontae lay fatally wounded. The officers who found him that night weren't just looking at another crime scene. They were standing over the body of a young man whose entire future had been erased. Keontae's death was not random. Investigators quickly discovered that he had been targeted. Within days, they identified 3 suspects: Logan Blair, 21, Matthew Allen, 22, and Decarius Thompson, 23. Each of them was tied to the community, young men not much older than Keontae himself. But instead of walking the same road of opportunity, they chose violence. Prosecutors charged all 3 with malice murder and felony murder, a reminder that the law saw their act as deliberate and cold-blooded. One suspect was arrested almost immediately, another was captured and extradited back to Georgia, and the third remained at large before finally being tracked down. For the Grider family, each arrest was another headline to read, another reminder of the nightmare they were trapped in. Justice might eventually be served, but nothing could bring Keontae home. Who was Keontae? He wasn't a troublemaker. He wasn't someone living recklessly. He was described by friends as respectful, humble, and deeply committed to his child. At just 21, he had embraced the responsibility of fatherhood with determination, willing to grind long warehouse shifts if it meant his child would have a brighter future. His murder wasn't just the loss of one man, it was the loss of a father, a role model, and a future that would never unfold. The aftermath was filled with grief. Candlelight vigils were held. Balloons drifted into the night sky in his honor. His family wept openly, not just for what they had lost, but for the life that could have been. His child, too young to understand, would grow up with memories built from stories instead of experiences. For the community of Liberty County, the pain of losing Keontae was raw and personal. And yet, what made the tragedy worse was the silence around motive. Why did 3 young men decide that Keontae had to die? Was it jealousy, a grudge, some petty dispute that spiraled into deadly violence? Police have not revealed a clear answer, leaving the family with the unbearable burden of not only losing him, but never fully understanding why. That unanswered why is its own kind of torment. This case is more than one family's tragedy. It reflects a growing, disturbing pattern across America in 2025. Violence spilling into the workplace. Warehouses, fast food chains, restaurants, and stores, places that should represent stability and livelihood, are becoming crime scenes. For workers, it's a reminder that danger doesn't just exist on the streets outside. Sometimes it's waiting where you earn your living. For Keontae's family, the question is not about the logistics of arrests or charges. It's about what they've lost. A son, a father, a young man with quiet dreams of a better life. For them, every holiday, every birthday, every milestone will now carry his absence, and for the rest of us, his stories should be a call to remember the human faces behind the headlines and the lives cut short before they ever reach their full promise. Keontae's name deserves to be remembered, not just as another victim of workplace violence, but as a father, a son, and a young man who worked hard for his family. His story lingers not because of how he died, but because of how much he still had to live for. The murder of Keontae Grider still leaves a heavy question mark. 3 suspects, 3 indictments, yet no clear motive for why a young father had to die. His family holds onto his memory while living with unanswered questions. But perhaps the darkest workplace tragedy of 2025 unfolded just 3 months later in Covington, Georgia. There, an employee didn't just kill inside his workplace, he carried the violence beyond the store into a private home, tearing down every boundary we thought existed between work life and personal life. It's a story of multiple lives stolen, a community terrorized, and a conclusion that left everyone shaken. In the early hours of April 11th, 2025, the Walmart Supercenter on Salem Road in Covington, Georgia, was closed to customers. The aisles were quiet, except for the steady sound of workers stocking shelves and preparing for the day ahead. For the overnight employees, it was just another shift. Among them was 21-year-old Khalaf Barksdale, a young man full of energy and promise, and 29-year-old Ryan Bradley, a steady worker building a life in his hometown. Just a few miles away, 19-year-old Akilah Clark, another Walmart employee, was at home getting ready for her morning. None of them knew that within hours, their lives would be ripped apart by someone they once called a coworker. That coworker was 24-year-old Dwayne Edu. Investigators later confirmed that Edu got into some form of dispute inside the store. Instead of walking away, he made a choice that would devastate families and shake the entire community. Edu left the Walmart, retrieved a firearm, and returned with deadly intent. Inside the store, he opened fire. Khalaf Barksdale, just 21 years old, was shot and killed instantly. Co-workers later described him as someone who lit up the room with his presence, a young man who had only just begun to shape his future. Ryan Bradley, 29, was also struck several times. He collapsed on the floor, critically injured, but clinging to life. By some miracle, Ryan survived, but his life would never be the same. Edu didn't stop there. He left Walmart and drove roughly 2 miles away to Emerson Trail, where 19-year-old Akilah Clark lived with her mother. Akilah had her entire life ahead of her, still a teenager, known for her warmth and her ambitions. But that morning, her home, the place that should have been her safest refuge, became the scene of unspeakable violence. Edu forced his way inside and shot Akilah in front of her mother. Samantha Clark later recalled the horror of watching her daughter plead for help before Edu pulled the trigger. For a parent, it was the ultimate nightmare, witnessing the violent end of their child's life. News of the killings spread fast. Employees and neighbors were in shock. A store that was supposed to provide security and opportunity had become the site of terror. For the families, the pain was unbearable. Khalaf's sister, Kaya, described him as loving and protective, someone who wanted better for himself and those he cared about. The grief was so heavy that friends and family released balloons into the sky to honor him, their tears mixing with disbelief. For Akilah's mother, there were no words strong enough, only the unbearable memory of being powerless to save her daughter. And for Ryan Bradley, survival came with scars, both physical and emotional. Edu, meanwhile, fled. His escape triggered a massive law enforcement response across Georgia and into South Carolina. Hours later, police tracked him to Aiken County, South Carolina, where he became cornered on Interstate 20. For hours, he refused to surrender, locked in a tense standoff with police. Negotiators pleaded with him, hoping to bring him in alive, but Edu chose a final act of violence, this time against himself. He turned the gun on his own head. Though he was rushed to a hospital, he died from his injuries, closing the case in blood, but leaving families with no answers. This was not an active shooter situation, Sergeant Jack Redlinger later explained. The suspect specifically targeted individuals they knew. His words underscored the terrifying reality. These weren't random victims. They were chosen. The aftermath left Covington shaken to its core. Vigils were held outside the Walmart, candles lit in honor of Khalaf and Akila. Coworkers hugged each other through tears, afraid to return to the place where the violence began. Customers who had shopped there for years now saw the store not as a place of community, but as a reminder of death. This case was different from the others because of its scale and escalation. It began at a workplace, but spilled into a private home, tearing down the boundary between work and sanctuary. It forced everyone to confront a truth most people try to ignore. Sometimes violence doesn't stay contained. Sometimes it follows you home. With Edu's death, there would be no trial, no cross-examinations, no courtroom testimony to explain the why. The victims' families were left with grief, pain, and endless questions. Why Khalaf? Why Akila? Why Ryan? Was this resentment a breakdown, or simply rage that found its targets? The lack of answers became its own wound. For the wider public, the Covington Walmart killings became one of the most disturbing examples of workplace violence in 2025. It was more than murder. It was a ripple of terror that spread from one workplace into an entire community, leaving scars that may never fully heal. And for all of us, it is a haunting reminder. Behind every headline are names, faces, and lives that once had futures. Khalaf Barksdale, 21, Akila Clark, 19, Ryan Bradley, 29. They were more than victims. They were sons, daughters, co-workers, friends, ordinary people whose lives were ripped away by extraordinary violence. We've walked through 6 workplace tragedies that shook 2025. Each story is different, but together they reveal a truth we cannot ignore. The places where we work, shop, and gather are not always as safe as they seem. At Lowe's, a workplace grudge ended in a calculated execution. At McDonald's, a simple dispute escalated into a brutal stabbing that left 6 children without their mother. At Wegmans, a warehouse murder sparked a desperate manhunt across state lines. In Brooklyn's IHOP, a former employee returned to settle a grudge that should have ended long ago. At Amazon, a young father was gunned down in the parking lot with no clear motive, leaving a child to grow up without him. And at Walmart in Covington, rage spilled beyond the workplace into a private home, taking multiple lives and terrorizing an entire community. What ties these cases together is not just the violence, but the lessons they leave behind. They warn us that unresolved conflict, unchecked grudges, and ignored warning signs can destroy lives. They remind us that workplace safety isn't just about policies. It's about people and about listening before it's too late. But above all, these are not just crime stories. They are human stories. Jeff Meller, Jennifer Harris, Jameer Ridley Smith, Hector Reinoso-Perez, Keontae Grider, Khalaf Barksdale, Akila Clark, and Ryan Bradley, who survived but carries the scars. They were fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, friends, co-workers. They had dreams, responsibilities, and people who loved them. Let their names stand as more than headlines. Let them be remembered as lives with meaning. And now, I want to hear from you. Which of these cases struck you the hardest? What lessons do you think we, as a society, need to learn to stop tragedies like these from happening again? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because the conversation doesn't end here. If you found value in these stories, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode of Unforeseen Fates. This is more than a channel. It's a community built on remembering victims, learning from tragedy, and making sure their stories live on. Rest in peace to the victims of these 6 cases. May their stories never be forgotten.